Ben Weingarten.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Josh Hammer.
And I'm Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we've got 4 excellent segments to work through. First, we'll be talking about Facebook having to grapple with litigation over alleged sex trafficking occurring on the platform. I'll talk a bit about the ever-expanding January 6th witch hunt and efforts to deprogram wrong thinkers. Emily will talk about corporate systemic inequality or the systemic problems associated with corporations in our society. And lastly, Josh will talk a bit about 1 year on China's crackdown in Hong Kong ever accelerating. So with that, let's turn it over first to Rachel on Facebook.
So last Friday, there was a ruling in a case in the Texas Supreme Court that was somewhat highly anticipated by those of us who very, boring watched the jurisprudence around Section 230. But as probably everyone's aware at this point, Section 230 is under a lot of scrutiny. It's this tiny provision of law which gives big tech its liability shield. And it's, the subject of many policy proposals in Congress, but also, a fair amount of litigation as well. And this was a very significant ruling. It dealt with the issue of sex trafficking on Facebook. And Facebook went to court and basically said, we bear no responsibility for our platform being used to facilitate the sex trafficking of minor girls. And the fact pattern in this case is really horrific. It involved 3 cases involving 14 and 15-year-old girls who were contacted on Facebook or Instagram by, far older men in their 30s, lured into in-person meetings, and then immediately, photographed, raped repeatedly, put on Backpage.com, the now defunct website, and sold into sex slavery. At one point, one of the 14-year-olds was rescued from that entrapment, and her Instagram profile, was still being used to try and lure, additional young women into this sex slavery, and her mother contacted Facebook through multiple channels, and the platform never responded. So this went to court, and Facebook said, look, we bear no responsibility for this under Section 230. We have complete, almost categorical immunity. You should just dismiss these cases out of hand without ever even considering the merits. Now, Annie McAdams, who is the plaintiff's attorney and sort of the hero of the story, has heroically been pursuing this Section 230 litigation on behalf of the victims of instances like this. She argued that no, Facebook should be held liable, for negligence, for product liability, and then also brought a case under Texas state statute that allowed, under its state trafficking law, the plaintiffs to pursue civil claim. Now, what was interesting about the court's decision is that, 25, 26 years of jurisprudence around Section 230 has been drastically expanded, to sort of meet what Facebook was arguing, that instead of this very porous, narrow liability that, I would argue Congress envisioned, the courts have really taken this and exploded it into a bulletproof liability to the extent that Facebook can go to court and plausibly argue that, we bear no responsibility at all. And the court agreed with that, right? And in the claims of negligence and product liability, the court's like, look, the jurisprudence is what it is. We cannot grant this. But under Texas state law, it allowed these claims to go forward. And this is a very significant case in that regard, because again, state courts have been loath to take on Section 230. But the other thing that I want to mention and highlight here is that in the court's opinion, it actually gave substantial credence to the fact that that body of jurisprudence that I mentioned might actually be wrong. And that's pretty tremendous. It actually cited Justice Thomas a number of times. It cited several amici who made the case that Justice Thomas also argued that, again, this immunity has been wildly conflated. We don't have to get into the technicalities, but, the conflation of, publisher and distributor liability, which Congress never intended. And I think it's significant that the court is actually saying, hey, Congress or the Supreme Court could act here and strike this whole thing down, and they actually might. But what I think is important here is not just the credence that the court gave to the fact that this body of jurisprudence might actually have been settled in error, but also that, the courts aren't going to solve this problem. And I think that's a really significant thing for lawmakers who are often saying, well, if we just make the right argument before the court, we don't have to act here because the courts will do it. It's very clear in this ruling the courts will not. And the court basically said, look, even if we wanted to, we are not in a position to upend, a settled law in this case. And also, oddly, they said, well, Facebook's economic dominance, a lot of people rely on the way, Section 230 is currently interpreted. So we don't want to upend this whole economic system, which I think is a bogus argument, but that's, what passes for conservative jurisprudence in many cases. And so I think, I wanted to highlight it because I think it's the first decision I've seen maybe ever that gave credibility to the fault lines that are developing around this issue. And I think very much put the momentum in Congress's lap to act here because the courts really aren't going to do it. But that said, the fact that the claims can be pursued under Texas state law means perhaps that the settled jurisprudence around Section 230 is crumbling. So with that, I'll toss it open to see what you guys think.
So I lack obviously the legal expertise here, and I'm very curious to hear what Josh says and maybe some framework as to thinking about this. Just very quickly, one of the interesting aspects is when Rachel mentions the judiciary saying, yeah, we're not going to act, that means that Congress, if something is wrong, should step in to right that unless we want the executive branch to wield more and grow more power. And in that case, what it becomes interesting, and this is the framework that maybe I can offer without any legal expertise, is that I don't think we have the framework right now legislatively to actually deal with the new kinds of monopolies that these companies are. And again, to me, that gets to why the FTC case was thrown out of court this week, is that we just, the reason upon which it was rejected, it's basically just, you have to make this case better. And there's so much room for Congress to create antitrust laws. It's not easy. It's really difficult, actually, because this is such a strange situation, an exceptional situation, and it's going to continue to be a problem as technology evolves and advances to places that are sort of were previously unknown unknowns. And that's what we're dealing with in this situation. But Congress has done really not much to say this is what antitrust should look like in the era of tech, to give the judiciary something to work with. I mean, the example of Facebook and Backpage postings is just such a good and tragic one. It's like if you pin that to a Starbucks wall in your local Starbucks, your local coffee shop, it's a much clearer case. And so it's an issue of we still haven't adapted legislatively to the changes in technology. And that's my very primitive, not a legal expertise understanding of this, but maybe it's a useful framework for thinking about some of it.
So I'm happy to hop in with just 3 quick points. One is just the higher level overview here, which Rachel said, which is totally accurate and was basically the column I wrote last week, is that the Supreme Court and the courts in general just will not be conservative saviors. I almost laugh just saying that, because how many freaking data points do we need over the course of decades to for this message to actually seep in to everyone in kind of the DC K Street class or whatever. But obviously it is just a complete fool's errand. Last week I talked about kind of the disappointments of the Fulton case of the Supreme Court with respect to not overturning the Employment Division versus Smith religious liberty precedent. Earlier this week, literally there were 2 votes. Justice Thomas and Justice Alito were the only 2 votes that wanted to hear this deeply problematic Fourth Circuit case, Grimm versus Gloucester County, which basically said that there is a statutory right under Title IX for a transgender student to use the bathroom that he or she identifies with. All 3 Trump nominees did not vote to hear that case. Now, there were some, if you really want to wiggle your way out of that one, there are some kind of tea leaves arguments. You could try to make it out to be some kind of 4D chess kind of thing, but the Occam's razor view of that is what it looks like, which is that these 3 justices are effectively just being cowardly on this. So the courts are not going to be our saviors here. I don't know how many times we need to kind of hammer that message home. On the Section 230 thing itself here, I think it's really interesting that this was a state court case. I used to live in Texas. Texas actually has an elected state judiciary. So all Supreme Court justices run statewide under partisan labels. At least when I lived there, and I think still the case, the entire Supreme Court are elected Republicans. So I guess if we're not going to get some movement there, then we're not going to get anywhere. So happy that this happened. I think kind of the state law route in general is an innovative way to go. Ron DeSantis has been talking a lot about kind of old school consumer protection, fraud statutes. I am deeply sympathetic. I think that's a great avenue here. I think state court litigation in general is very promising, in contrast to federal court litigation, largely because of all this horrible precedent that Rachel's alluding to. That's kind of the Justice Thomas malware case where he talks about the erroneous interpretations of 230. Just the final point real quick. I think it's also just, it's worth emphasizing here. I mean, we devoted an entire episode to Justice Thomas's concurrence in the Knight First Amendment case 2.5 months ago or so. But he talks about this other concept that Rachel's talking about here too, which is 230 has been erroneously interpreted to preempt state laws that would otherwise deal with the problem. So I'll just very quickly read from footnote 5 of the Justice Thomas concurrence in the Knight First Amendment case. He says, Section 230, quote, immunity eliminates the biggest deterrent, a private lawsuit, against caving to an unconstitutional government threat. For similar reasons, some commentators have suggested that immunity provisions like Section 230 could potentially violate the First Amendment to the extent those provisions preempt state laws that protect speech from private censorship. So to the extent that we have federal avenue in 230, federal litigation, I think that's what we should narrowly target, is to try to get it so that's interpreted to not preempt these state laws. So that's it.
Yeah, I have little to add except to say that as our viewers and listeners probably recall, I believe we should put zero faith in the courts for anything whatsoever, and that the fact that we defer all of these questions to the courts represents a complete dereliction of duty of the legislative branch, and also, of course, exceeding to the power of the executive as well. In this case, it's remarkable to me, and I think it shows, it demonstrates how low our expectations have to have been set, that we're celebrating the fact that a judge says, well, Section 230 doesn't make it so that it's basically like the law of the open seas when it comes to anything that happens on platforms goes that wouldn't go in real life. But I guess this does pass as something that reflects courage or a break from horrible precedent, and we ought to break horrible precedent. And I hope that we now push forward more conservative judges who do believe in running roughshod over bad precedent, but I don't expect that to be the case. I agree. We have to have an all of the above effort here among this legislative branch, of course, lawfare as well, using state laws where necessary, all of the above, every tool on the table. Those on the other side, of course, will use every tool to dominate us. And so why wouldn't we muster the same sort of effort? It's obvious to me. And with that, I'll transition to myself. I'll be talking a little bit today about this rolling sort of January 6th witch hunt. And I'm sure in future episodes, we'll talk about whatever probe Nancy Pelosi is cooking up currently with respect to January 6th. At a basic level, we spoke in a prior episode about this countering domestic terrorism strategy that the Biden administration has put forth. And January 6th is one of the catalysts for that strategy, or at least it's used as a justification for the strategy, who that strategy targets, and also the means by which it is going about targeting them. And one of the things that's important to note is that strategy claims, and this is based on an intelligence community assessment, which is not rooted in any sort of empirical evidence. You're just supposed to take it as fact that our intelligence overlords are doing things in an above board and apolitical fashion when they're coming up with these assessments, which would fly in the face of everything that we've learned over the last 4+ years about those of the highest ranks of our national security and intelligence apparatuses, not to mention what's going on with our military right now, which is embroiled in wokeism to the nth degree. The assessment says, essentially, we assess that over the next year, there will be domestic violent extremists who are motivated by narratives such as 2020 election fraud. In other words, the notion that the 2020 election was stolen is going to incite people to rise up and act. And of course, January 6th is looked at as the perfect example of this and used to justify this entire domestic war on terror. Well, if my argument is right, that the prosecutions and really the political persecutions of those associated with January 6th, many of whom have no criminal backgrounds whatsoever and were essentially engaging in glorified trespassing on the Capitol grounds, if the effort to go after them is rooted in this sort of domestic war on terror paradigm, which says election fraud is one of the signifiers of someone who's radicalizing, that is, you believe that there was election fraud, well, then I think we see a few examples that make the perfect case that this is the archetype. January 6th prosecution is the archetype of the domestic war on terror, which I've termed a war on wrongthink. And Julie Kelly has written some exceptional reported pieces on this. She talked about essentially how there's a lawyer, a state-provided lawyer for many January 6th defendants who cannot afford private lawyers themselves, who is going about essentially re-educating her clients. And in one instance, a client has said essentially to the court, I apologize for what I did. I was mistaken about American history. I repent for my political views and sins, and Joe Biden is the duly elected president, et cetera, paraphrasing here. And there have been a number of cases actually where judges and prosecutors as well have essentially said defendants cannot be released prior to trial because they pose a risk because of their views about election fraud. And that's almost not even paraphrasing it. That is actually the argument being made, that you are a danger to society, potentially a radical terrorist, to the extent you do not believe that the last election was completely above board and 100% legitimate. This is an incredibly scary standard for America to be operating under. It's even more scary, again, when we're talking about an entire war on domestic terror, which cites as the radicals, potentially radical domestic violent extremists, those who adhere to these views. And it makes you wonder, why do they have to censor all information regarding questions about the integrity of the 2020 election? Why is the Justice Department, for example, targeting states that are going about conducting audits associated with the election? Well, if you say that it's a national security threat, that allows you to justify quashing all sorts of wrong think in society. So I just think that Julie Kelly's reporting on those being held in pretrial detention, circumstances that in some cases appear to be almost cruel and unusual punishment, not in the legal definition, but in the reasonably understood definition. And then you look at these prosecutions where it's essentially making people repent for their sins, engage in Chinese Communist Party style forced confessions for glorified trespassing at the Capitol. We're in a very scary and dark place in America, and this deserves significantly more focus than it's getting. And if a few lawmakers have asked questions regarding January 6th, especially highlighting the fact that the legal world, the DOJ and the FBI have pursued January 6th in a way that they did not pursue those who participated in last summer's 1619 riots. But this goes far deeper, to the point of persecuting people for their political beliefs. And that puts us in a very un-American place. So I wonder if anyone has any impressions, if you've read the Julie Kelly article about deprogramming certain defendants, and also even innocent individuals. Miranda Devine wrote about this in New York Post. Innocent individuals who were in Washington, D.C. that day, near the Capitol, documented what transpired at the Capitol and have had their lives destroyed by agents as well. Just chilling to watch. So curious if anyone has any thoughts.
Well, I mean, the obvious one is this taking on this weird, authoritarian Chinese sign the confession and we'll let you out kind of flair. But I think what's kind of amazing to watch too is that, and Glenn Greenwald has written about this, that, the left, which is always, and I think justifiably in many cases, been suspicious of, the NSA and the deep state and the spy state. And exactly this type of behavior is now promoting it, right? James Clapper, all these people who personally, I think, should be prosecuted for lying to Congress, breaking into the Senate Intelligence Committee archives in some cases, hacking staffer computers. We know this was done during the Obama years and no one ever was punished for it. He has a primetime, cable news contract. This is the upside down world that we're living in, where there's this element of what used to be, liberalism, which is now, sliding into authoritarianism, saying, yes, our spy masters are celebrities. And these people are applauded instead of being held accountable. And so that's just an element, I think, of what you're talking about, which I just think writ large is a very concerning development about punishing political prisoners here in the United States.
Yeah. So, two things can obviously be true at once here, right? January 6th was obviously a very bad day. Edmund Burke Foundation, our fearless leader, Yoram Hazony, released what I thought was a pretty compelling video, just kind of detailing what went wrong on that day. And we should not look back on and say that it was anything other than a bad day. At the same time, it obviously is being weaponized by the left in kind of classic Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste fashion, to kind of subjugate the deplorables. And we see this over and over and over again, right? January 6th, it to in effect was one of the greatest things that the ruling class could have ever asked for, because it was that Rahm Emanuel crisis that was presented to them right there, right on a silver platter, allowing them to do that which they already wanted to do, but didn't necessarily have the fig leaf, kind of the hook, so to speak, to actually implement. So that's definitely my read on the situation here. I mean, look, what the stuff that like we're kind of like reading. I mean, I'm happy you mentioned Julie Kelly's reporting, Ben. She's been on this for a very long time. I mean, solitary confinement and things like that. I mean, this is just totally absurd, frankly. And it just kind of anecdotally, in my own experience, I've seen a little bit of this play out. I co-host another podcast now through my main employer, Newsweek, called The Debate. And without naming names, we were doing what were we debating? I can't remember. We were doing like the voting rights, the Georgia like election laws and stuff. And one of the guests that we invited refused to appear with the other guests that we had invited because he was in the vicinity of the Capitol on January 6th. Now, he was there as like a reporter, as like someone to like talk about and like, for his own like shows, media, etc., discuss what's going on. He was not like inside the walls saying like hang Mike Pence or anything like that. But that's just like one anecdote that I think clarifies the extent to which these people are taking this, and they are distorting it and turning to something that it very, very clearly is not.
Yeah, and the government does not wield its power responsibly, and we know that, and that's why we are conservatives. And we see this across the board. We've seen this for years. As the government sort of amasses power, it uses it even more recklessly because it's a tangled, sprawling bureaucracy where things can hide. And of course, the media is not covering what's happening in this case because they're not interested in it. So it can just sort of move along as conservative media and Glenn Greenwald sound the alarms, and nobody really cares. And I think Glenn's position on this has been instructive. Somebody who has fought literally similar instances on the left of just sort of government running amok with its power. And I think this is a good example. I mean, every time I look up at MSNBC, I just sort of keep it on in the background. They are replaying footage of January 6th. The left loves January 6th. It is June. Obviously, everyone in the country was disgusted. The vast majority of people in this country were disgusted by what they saw happening. As I was there covering it, I was thinking, just to the point that Josh made, how incredibly counterproductive this is to the goals of people who are storming the halls of the Capitol building. It's going to be, I was thinking in my head as I was watching, this is going to be used against all of you in ways that, you would be deeply upset about. And of course, we've seen that happen. But what worries me is the inflation of the definition of what constitutes a domestic extremist. And that's at the heart of all of this, I think, is where the government is trying to increase its powers with an increased definition of who constitutes a threat. And that's the threat. And I think in some of these specific cases, you can see, as Josh mentioned, like solitary confinement. Geez, what's up? But on the whole, we should be deeply concerned about the inflation of the definition of what constitutes an extremist or a white supremacist, or what constitutes violence in and of itself. It was sort of these abstract notions that just lingered on the fringes of academia for years that have now been mainstreamed about what constitutes extremism and violence, literally the definition of the word violence. And the government, combination of the government wanting more power to go after people like that, with the definition of those threats increasing, I think is what's really scary. And we do see some of that in these cases.
All right, well, with that, let's transition back to you, Emily, so we can talk about the auxiliaries of the deep state in corporate America.
Well, so Senator Josh Hawley sat for an interview with Real Clear Politics recently, where it was a conversation largely focused on critical race theory. And Josh Hawley sort of turned this around, and he said, if you want to talk about systemic problems in the country, quote, look at what corporate America has done to our inner cities, to our rural areas, and then look at their systematic policy of hollowing out our industrial base. And I want to talk about that because I think it is a it raises a very interesting concept. Part of the problem in our conversation about racism and systemic racism is that we do not share a definition of what constitutes systemic. There are all kinds of different definitions of what systemic racism or discrimination actually looks like. And I think for Hawley to raise this issue of systemic patterns from corporate America, not only is it smart, but it's extremely important, because this is exactly an example of how the system is legally set up with, like, for instance, our tax code that allows corporations to get away with some of this nonsense. That is by definition systemic. And I think this is, there are two conversations here. What is the definition of systemic, and does racism meet that definition, or does the corporate malfeasance meet that definition? And what is happening in corporate America actually creating so much more pain, it would seem, than what Ibram X. Kendi and Robin Angelo are describing for members of the working class, disenfranchised communities, whether they're white or black or in rural areas or the inner cities. And I'm curious what you guys think about the framing of this issue as one of systemic corporate malfeasance.
Yeah, I mean, part of the question obviously is like, what system are we talking about here? I mean, I think the details of Senator Hawley's arguments need to be filled in, but I'm happy that he's kind of like issuing this salvo. Certainly, I mean, look, Senator Hawley's kind of the tip of the spear as far as I see it on Capitol Hill, is kind of this like kind of like economic policy realignment, two cheers for capitalism, common good capitalism, whatever you want to call it. He's really touched on this in a number of areas. I mean, literally everything, obviously, from kind of antitrust to big tech. I think he has some kind of heterodox views, even on kind of the Federal Reserve and monetary policy, although I don't recall that at a specific level of detail. But anyway, when he is kind of sending off a salvo like this, I think it's kind of a message. It's kind of a testing of the waters, so to speak, to see what other kind of realignment curious legislators, maybe you might say, might be kind of willing to kind of hop online here. Now, just in general, kind of like taking like a slightly like more abstract view. I mean, I'm happy when I hear these kind of things here, because as we've said over and over again on this podcast, it has never been more exceedingly obvious that corporate America is not the friend of conservatives. For whatever kind of benefits, obviously, the Republican Party corporate bromance may or may not have had during kind of, the halcyon days of the Reagan era, and, the Wall Street Journal editorial board during the Bush administration, and free people, free trade, free minds, all that stuff. That bromance is over. And corporate America only has itself to blame for it, frankly, because they are the ones who are effectively persecuting conservatives. They're the people that are picking up and moving their corporations out of states like Georgia when they pass a very anodyne, frankly, milquetoast election law with like early voting and voter ID provisions that are more liberal than Joe Biden's own home state of Delaware. So in general, I am team kind of GOP corporate divorce in general. That's kind of slightly oversimplifying it, obviously. There are some there's some questions that have to be answered pertaining to kind of long-term fundraising viability and things like that. But to kind of take us back to our or at least my favorite kind of leitmotif on this podcast of punishing our enemies and rewarding our friends within the confines of the rule of law. Corporate America is just not our friend, and it's time that they be treated as such.
So I think the distinction that Josh Hawley is making is a prescient one, as usual. I think he really is fearless, I think, in articulating a lot of sort of the modern issues that we have. But for the Republican Party, I think a lot of his critique is a finger pointing back at us to some extent, right? And both parties in particular, but I think both of the parties have been complicit in creating this monster that is kind of woke corporate America. The hollowing out of our industrial base is incentivized. Like we are seeing the consequences of the policies that we have wrought. And so I'm not super optimistic that the Republican Party is prepared intellectually, I think, to engage this argument, but I am, encouraged to see it being made. But this is a ship we have to turn, I think, because our economy has just changed so significantly in the last 20, 30 years. And it's been the result of policies that we ourselves have put into place. So unless we are truly willing to grapple with that and the consequences of that, then I think this merely remains a true rhetorical point. But if it's going to have substance, you have to have policymakers, I think, that are willing to make a serious paradigm shift in a way that, some Republican lawmakers on the right won't even do with big tech, despite ample evidence that it's warranted. So I'm not as optimistic it'll be applied to the entire economy.
Yeah, I think the comments point to a bipartisan failing to put the American people first and to put, I guess, the constituency they prioritize over the American people, the donor class first. And so it's right. It's a good thing that Senator Hawley targets corporations here. Also, as a rhetorical device, I think throwing systemic anything back at the left and the woke kind of uniparty in particular is a good thing. I mean, I've long argued that by its own standards, the left is systemically racist because all the inequalities that they talk about on a racial basis have occurred under Democrat rule in all the largely minority areas in this country. So we should always throw it back at them on the merits and because it's also good rhetoric. And all that aside, the thing that came to mind looking through Senator Hawley's comments was really that this was sort of Senator Hawley's version of Trumpism. He talked about American carnage in his remarks. He also talked about literally carnage. He used that word. And he also talks about the hollowing out of the middle class and offshoring of jobs and the like. And what looms over all of that, of course, is the uniparty's kowtowing to communist China, which will be a nice transition to Josh in our last segment. And I actually spoke with a very senior Trump administration national security official this week. And one of the things he noted in talking about US-China policy was that everywhere he went around the country in speaking with voters, those who might not have even been with President Trump in 2016, the topic of China always came up as a top 3 issue. It hit people at a gut level. It was something that was a consistent campaign point in 2016 and probably to a lesser extent in 2020. And I think it's because it speaks to the notion of prioritizing non-Americans over Americans and putting America's national interests last. And that goes beyond economics as well to national security when you're talking about an industrial base. So I think it's critical to keep a focus on these points because it's right and it's also good politics as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Josh or Emily. Feel free to jump back in.
I was just going to say, speaking of the system, we're literally talking on the very week that the Nike CEO said that he's a company buying for China, and that is a part of the system and has been incentivized by the system. And so to the extent that we want to talk about the financial system in the United States harming workers and harming people all over the country at a systemic scale, look no further than Nike.
Yeah. No, and
Josh.
Yeah, for sure. No, and like the quote from Nike from the CEO is just beyond abhorrent. And it could not come at a worse time because this week the Chinese Communist Party is celebrating the rest of the world. Is lamenting and mourning the 100th anniversary of that horrific organization. And at Newsweek, I'm publishing numerous kind of op-eds. I wouldn't say commemorating. I would say kind of poking a finger in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party. Specifically, I'm publishing a long excoriating op-ed from Senator Marco Rubio that's going to drop at noon Eastern time, the Wednesday of this week, which would be midnight, July 1, which is the day of the 100th year anniversary in Beijing. So that'll be a nice kind of 100-year celebration wake-up call for them, hopefully. But in any event, let's focus a little bit on what's happening in Hong Kong, because that's kind of the impetus for what's going on here. I've been to Hong Kong. One of my best friends from law school actually is from there. I visited his family, spent maybe like 4 or 5, 6 days there. It was great. I was there 5 years ago. It's genuinely one of the coolest places I've visited in my entire life. I had such an amazing time. But I don't really care to talk much about that. But specifically, let's take the history back a little bit further here. So in late January 2018, there was a horrific murder. There was a 19-year-old Hong Kong resident who murdered his 19-year-old pregnant girlfriend, fiance, I don't remember the relationship, in Taiwan. He fled back to Hong Kong, and then he confessed to Hong Kong authorities what he did, but they could not extradite him to Taiwan because there was not kind of an extradition agreement in place. So in February of 2019, the Hong Kong Legislative Council, and I'm sure the listeners are savvy enough to understand this, but in 1997, the UK effectively hands off Hong Kong to China under the kind of so-called one country, 2 systems agreement. It was a 50-year transition period. And then 50 years later, in the year 2047, it was understood that China would take full control of Hong Kong. So at this time in 2019, when this extradition treaty was kind of making its way up through the process, the CCP in Beijing had already kind of issued out feelers to kind of put the Hong Kong people, I think, on notice a little bit that they were going to expedite this 50-year transition period, to put it politely. And this treaty which was kind of for the fact reason was to extradite this murderer to Taiwan. That's a good thing. Was written in such a purposely vague way, no doubt with Beijing's lobbyists there on the ground, so as to permit extraditions to mainland China itself. So they started a whole year of kind of on and off protests, reaching a culmination in August 2019. And it got really ugly there. My good friend from Hong Kong said that at one point, almost 80% of the subway stations were bombed. There were some legitimate anarchists there kind of taking advantage of the fray, as always happens in these situations. But in any event, after that very sorry period, Beijing passed its kind of infamous national security law, which was a completely broadly written authoritarian kind of Leninist style piece of legislation that had a retroactivity provision that would allow Beijing to prosecute those who protested during this extradition treaty affair. So, Jimmy Lai, who was the founder and publisher of Apple Daily, which is a major paper there. It's a little tabloidy. My friend says they to this day have a porn spread on the back, which partially probably explains its wild popularity there. So it's not exactly kind of like a reputable New York Times, Washington Post-esque publication, but it is wildly popular, and they do have a very legitimate investigative reporting department, I'm told. So Jimmy Lai was prosecuted over a year ago, basically shortly after the national security law came into effect. And most recently, what happened was this past week, Apple Daily published its final issue. And what happened was the CCP they raided the offices, they made arrests of the editors, they froze the assets. And Apple Daily, which again, it's not like a New York Times, Washington Post kind of paper of record, but it is wildly popular among the people there and does have a very legitimate investigative reporting wing. They ran their final issue last Friday on the deepest authoritarian grounds possible. Literal government agents raiding newspaper offices, making arrests, freezing assets, just horrible, horrible, horrible stuff. And, as Gordon Chang, who's, one of my go-to China columnists for Newsweek, wrote last week, this effectively marks the end of free democratic rule in Hong Kong. This is happening, obviously, 26 years before 2047. So the CCP not exactly keeping its word on the 50-year transition period from Hong Kong, from the British to the Chinese. No surprise there to anyone. As of today, Hong Kong's other newspapers, the South China Morning Post, which kind of is their New York Times equivalent, that's their major paper, still does have a robust kind of editorial page, op-ed section that's criticizing China for what they've done to Apple Daily and so forth. But, query how long that's going to last at this point. It kind of seems like the writing's on the wall here. So, I'm happy to kind of throw it open to the panel on that note. It's just so sad to me. I mean, I remember when I was there in Hong Kong, I actually went into a court because, we're both lawyers. We wanted to see what their court system looked like in action. It was incredibly legitimate. And it was, because they kind of have this British heritage, it was kind of Anglo common law style judging. All of that is increasingly looking like it's going to die. And one very quick final point I'll make. The last time I saw this friend, we FaceTimed very briefly with his mom back in Hong Kong, and she was telling me how she was out to dinner recently there. And this was in April, so before even the Apple Daily raid. She said that she was worried to even discuss any of this stuff with friends out at dinner because the waiters might hear something. They didn't know where it was bugged, and just a terrible situation in a true kind of a beacon of the world. I mean, it really is a great city. So it just makes me so profoundly sad, but I'll stop filibustering, kind of kick it over. Ben, Ben, you write on this all the time. So maybe you want to start with some of your own thoughts on what's happening there in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I mean, I too share your sort of lamentations. I arrived in Hong Kong. It was the first stop on my honeymoon, actually, 6 years ago as well. And was also just thought it was an exceptional city, dynamic, vibrant, a reflection of what freedom at its best. But even at that time, I spoke with a tour guide and asked, what's happening to the education system, the books that are used in the public schools. And even then there was the creeping CCP influence. And there have been sort of a series of incremental measures since 1997. And now all at once, a dramatic purge of wrongthink as well in society. And that national security law even extends well beyond the borders of Hong Kong. It essentially can be used by the Chinese Communist Party to pursue people anywhere who run afoul of the law. And the law, of course, is written in such a liberal way as to characterize almost anything as being a conspiracy against the Chinese Communist Party. And there's language about collusion, at least in the English translation as well, colluding with foreign governments against the Chinese Communist Party as grounds for it to pursue people. So it's incredibly sad to see democracy die not in darkness, but in broad daylight. And where is woke capital on Hong Kong? In fact, some of the major banks are actually expanding their business in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong is just going to be, Hong Kong is China now, effectively. And that's a horrible thing to witness, especially with a treaty, as you noted, that was, of course, disregarded. And this should be a signal to everyone in the world that this is what it means when you do business with the Chinese Communist Party. And this is why Taiwan so sticks in the craw of communist China, because it is another beacon of liberty and democracy in the world that speaks to what China could be were its people to be freed of the clutches of the CCP. So I think we ought to take stock and also evaluate our own policies versus the policies of the CCP, because there are too many parallels right now that I see in the way our government is pursuing wrong thinkers in a way that evokes sort of a soft, light version of what's transpiring over there. And this is really convergence in some ways that we're seeing. There was a concept of convergence during the Cold War that the Soviet Union and the United States might ultimately come together in sort of the nature of their systems. And all too frequently, we're seeing that right now. And you see it in the kowtowing of our biggest corporations and our political leaders as well to the CCP. Hong Kong should serve as a cautionary tale for anyone who believes this is a regime to be dealt with as a partner, anything less than an adversary. It's an adversary, and it's the strongest adversary that we face in the world, period, full stop.
Yeah, I think that distinction is really critical. I don't have a ton to add except to highlight what you just said, which is China is showing us who they are. Right? There's no equivocation here. There's no having to read some books to understand. No, they are showing us who they are. And the fact that that our corporations respond like Nike CEO did, which is, we are a China, whatever he said about, we're here for the Chinese people, or we're a company, for China. I don't remember the exact quote. The fact that we still have people in the United States and our foreign policy establishment, that try to deny this fact, that we're still debating about how Chinese state-owned actors engage our free market on American soil. All of our policy about China needs to be filtered through this lens, because China has shown us who they are in Hong Kong, and there's no equivocation on that point.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I will add, this puts corporate America and politicians who support it in a very increasingly difficult position, because as we see more and more of this in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, in other places in China, this is happening across the entire country. I did a podcast yesterday with a reporter who has been covering what happens in Xinjiang, exactly what Josh described about people having to fear what they're saying in restaurants with friends and family because they don't know if a waiter. That's happening in Xinjiang with people's children. They're worried that their children will report them if they commit something that looks like wrongthink. China is weaponizing its surveillance state in a way that is abusing human rights, not even just in these ways that we think of, extent that we think about it, which the public largely, the media doesn't talk about it enough, the political establishment doesn't talk about it enough, because it puts it in an extremely compromising situation. It's incredibly compromising to have the CEO of Nike talking like that on a week where Josh highlighted this is what's happening in Hong Kong. You are profiting off of and you're aiding and abetting that regime. That's what happens. You are 100%, the CCP is entangled with businesses in that country to the extent that you are helping the CCP when you do commerce there on the scale that Nike does it, let alone the way that people are treated in the production and in the labor that goes into making their products. This is extremely damning for corporate America, and it is, as we hear more and more about this, as the situation escalates in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, it's going to get to a boiling point. It's going to hit a point where we have to disentangle ourselves from this evil country and stop letting people in the United States say that they're by and of and for it, because it is evil and it is hurting its own people. It is keeping them oppressed. It is keeping them in these horrible situations. It's doing it intentionally, and your commerce there is giving the people who are doing all of that more and more power. So it has to come to a breaking point. The question is when.
So with that, let's go to our parting shots, and I'll actually echo Emily to kick us off, which is the Chinese Communist Party's entire strategy, essentially post-Cold War and even during the Cold War, was to open itself up to the West and welcome our capital, our technology, welcome the entree we provided it to the world financial architecture, trade architecture, economic architecture, all of our diplomatic institutions and beyond. And it was a brilliant strategy demonstrating that China knew us, or the Chinese Communist Party knew us and our naivete and greed better than we knew its nature. And even when it showed us its nature at Tiananmen Square, for example, it wasn't even a speed bump in its rise to being the primary adversary, most formidable adversary to America today. I think it's critical, Emily, you hit on a really important point there, which is that if you do business in China and you do business with Chinese entities, in effect, at the end of the day, you're doing business with the Chinese Communist Party. And until there's a broad understanding of that across the corporate world, in the media, in academia, in our political system, obviously, we're poised to potentially lose long term. And what that loss looks like doesn't mean a Chinese takeover of the United States, but it might mean that China calls the shots and everyone else in the world gets in line. And we would be essentially second-class citizens in a global world ruled by the CCP, which is essentially a thugocratic organization. It's a criminal organization in effect, a totalitarian organization, and one that ultimately wants to dominate us. And until there's a broad understanding of that, I fear that we're poised to be in a very bad position in terms of our trajectory versus communist China's trajectory. So all I'd add is we have to decouple from every strategically significant sector, and there has to be a broad understanding in society that when you do business with Chinese entities, you're doing business with the CCP, and you're empowering a gulag-running, totalitarian, human rights squelching, anti-American regime par excellence, the most powerful evil regime in this century. That ought to be stated openly, clearly, and honestly. And until and unless it is, we're in trouble over the long run. With that, I'll turn it over to the parting shots of the rest of the crew.
So I just want to possibly like tie Ben and Emily's segments together, because so much of how we address sort of corporate wokeism and also the China element from the right requires the right to rethink a lot of how it's approached, business necessarily, and our theories of markets butting up against so often a reality that doesn't dispel them completely, but demonstrates that I think our definition of how things should be, our definition of a free market has changed, has translated into this like weird corporatism that we now defend as a free market in a way that it is not anymore. I have a friend who's in law school right now, and he spent the last semester texting me during his corporations class, lamenting the fact that all of corporate law seems designed to incentivize companies away from being American, right? These companies are incentivized to, flail at the feet of China because that's where they can make, the most money. And this goes to our entire policy structure, right? We demand this decoupling. We demand, and I think rightly so, that our corporations call out and stop working with countries that are just fundamentally evil, as Emily pointed out, yet our policy incentivizes them to do it, right? We have to grapple with that fact. I think, again, to reassess how our theory of market isn't necessarily bearing out, I'm reminded of a Wall Street Journal opinion piece that was published yesterday by a libertarian economist who argued that Republicans should be for reinstituting the SALT tax deduction, quote, because it's good for rich people. That's actually something that was published in the Wall Street Journal. And again, this is like in theory, right? Yeah, great. In theory, we do want rich people to have money to invest. But in practice, you're not telling me that they're using their money that way. In practice, they're incentivized to malinvest in private equity who will over leverage and get bailed out by the government. And that helps no one. So there's a comprehensive rethinking, I think, that has to go on to address these things intellectually on the right. And I'm encouraged that some people are throwing up the flare, Josh Hawley in particular. But there's a lot of work to be done here, I think, if we're really going to address this from the right.
And speaking of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, they recently said the real scandal of the ProPublica leaks was the leaks itself and not the information in those documents. And it's just a good example of this sort of calcified mindset that I think does really need to change, because as Rachel said, to bridge those two statements, or to bridge our two segments, Ben and mine, is that we're coming to this realization that the system, the financial system that conservatives revered and advanced for a long time, doesn't work in 2021 and needs to be tweaked and needs to better serve people for the sake of the common good, while also obviously adhering to the basic logic that we all believe in, that markets lift people up, that free markets are the way to lift people out of poverty. They're the best way to promote all of those important things like prosperity and freedom. And you can have maximum prosperity and maximum freedom when you truly have a system where cronyism is rooted out, and markets are freer. But we can't sort of emphasize the market part of that. We have to emphasize the people who are the consumers and the producers. And the producers are compromised by their allegiance to a foreign power that is utterly hostile to us. In every way. Their goal is to undermine the United States. And if we can't understand that, and you have major CEOs saying their allegiance, they're by and of China, whatever the heck he said, it just, to me, it creates, my final thought is basically that, how do we, and Yoram has written about this, how, without the sense of national identity, when you have a CEO of Nike talking like that, how do we go forward? I mean, how on earth do you go forward when you have just Hawley and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren talking about things, but everybody else in between them saying, well, yeah, Nike is creating a unification, a cultural marriage. Come on, that doesn't work anymore.
So I can't remember if we've discussed on this podcast before. I shouldn't be smiling. It's genuinely horrifying. Have y'all seen the John Cena apology that he did with respect to Taiwan? It is one of the most disgusting things I've literally ever seen in my entire life. And just to try and describe it the best I can for the listeners and the viewers, I guess he had referred to the country of Taiwan in some context here, and clearly, you know, some folks from Beijing, from the Politburo there, managed to find their way to him, and they browbeated him into doing this. I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, I literally didn't think I was watching a real human being. I thought I was watching like a cartoon. Apology that he just totally prostrated himself before these Leninist totalitarian jerks, I mean, for lack of a better term. And he basically said, like, not only is Taiwan not a country, but it might as well be as fake as Zootopia. And don't get me started on Tibet, for heaven's sake. You know, people of Tibet have been oppressed for, effectively since the CCP took over in 47, 48, right? So, I mean, just evil stuff. And like, evil is the right word. I mean, you are prostrating yourself, you are kowtowing the same way that the Nike CEO is doing before a regime that, according to, the interpretation of the Geneva Conventions and according to the best that quote unquote international law has given us, is literally committing genocide. Again, that is not like a conservative right-wing Republican talking point. The Biden administration has effectively said that the Trump administration was correct to recognize that what is happening in Xinjiang is genocide. So, I mean, look, this decoupling, I mean, it's got to happen somehow. And I think the best way that it can possibly start to happen, because everyone, the wokesters, the corporate America C-suite, because they're so kind of cynical and self-interested, I think the best way to possibly make it happen is to make it hurt at the pocketbook, to make it work, to make it hurt at kind of the personal investment level. If there's ever a silver lining out of the genuinely horrifying, awful situation that is the loss of a free Hong Kong, it possibly could be that, because for most of the past century and like the past first 2 decades of this century, certainly the Hong Kong Stock Exchange is one of the 3 great stock exchanges in the world. I mean, it's New York, it's the FTSE in London, and it's Hong Kong. Those are like the 3 kind of financial hubs of the world. At least they have been, obviously. So if there's any silver lining to what looks like the end of freedom and one of the world's great bastions of freedom, maybe it's that it will make these woke CEOs' bottom lines and their market caps, valuation, et cetera, actually hurt. And maybe then we'll start to see some genuine movement on the serious kind of across the board, all of the above decoupling that Ben is rightly, angry about, that really just has to happen.
Well, on that sunny note, on behalf of Josh, Emily, and Rachel, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Weingarten. We'll see you all at the next NatCon Squad.